Good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. My name is Salim Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Social Responsibility in Mining at the University of Queensland, which is part of the Sustainable Minerals Institute at UQ. And as you've heard before, UQ is one of the implementing partners of the International Mining for Development Center. I'm going to try and, first of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which we are gathered today. This is a very important ceremonial gesture which Australia really leads the way on in terms of Indigenous respect. I moved to Australia last year from the United States, and I must say, regrettably, even though we have our own Indigenous communities, we don't do such a gesture. So the Australian people and the Australian culture is to be commended on this gesture. Now, in terms of our mandate today, this afternoon, the goal is to focus on trying to understand ways of preventing conflict through positive stakeholder engagement. And we're going to try and do this in a conversational way. There's been feedback from the audience that we haven't had enough time for conversations, and our distinguished panelists concur and have agreed to keep to the 10-minute time limit. I'm also going to try something different in terms of audience participation. You're welcome to raise your hand and ask questions from the floor, as has been done in earlier sessions. However, we'll also provide an additional opportunity if you would like to write down a question and you're feeling shy or you don't get enough time to actually get your question on the floor. The ushers will be collecting any handwritten notes, questions which you may have, and I'll make sure that those are also conveyed to the panelists, and we'll try to get to those as well. So please, as the conversations proceed, consider questions, write them down as well, and we'll try to get them some audience as well. This, of course, does not preclude you from asking questions from the floor as well. All right, well, I'll introduce our panelists collectively, and then we'll start off with their brief presentations. Our first panelist is Dame Meg Taylor, who is the Vice President and Compliance Advisor Ombudsman for the World Bank Group. Meg Taylor is a national of Papua New Guinea. She's a distinguished diplomat, but very modestly, she told me not to go into her detailed bio, which is in your packet. And she wants to be known far more for her work with communities, and having seen her travel schedule over the last several months, she is really trying to get into the trenches and understand the causes of conflict, and that's really where we're trying to get at too, is really trying to understand the core causes of conflict. Our next panelist is Aidan Davey, who is the Deputy President and Senior Program Director at the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM, which many of you are familiar with, is the industry body that has a mandate for improving social performance in the mining and metals sector. He also leads ICMM's work on social and economic development, investor engagement, sustainability reporting, and independent assurance. He has 25 years of cross-sectoral experience, including time at the World Bank, and has been involved in numerous efforts in improving the social performance of the extractive industries, even outside his role with the World Bank. Our next panelist is Doris Puyahi, who is the program manager for Live and Learn Solomon Islands. Live and Learn Environmental Education is the full title of the organization, and for the past 4 years, since 2009, this organization has worked with heavily logged rural communities in the Solomon Islands to support them to continue to resist logging by strengthening alternative livelihoods. So to try and find alternatives to sort of very intensive logging practices. One focus of her project is working with communities to acknowledge and address the need to empower rural-based women to realize their leadership potential and take part in important decision-making processes regarding natural resources management. Our final panelist will be Alex Benkenstein, who is a senior researcher with the Governance of Africa's Resources Program for the South African Institute for International Affairs, based in Cape Town. And he has been working in various parts of Africa dealing with issues of conflict resolution, and he'll especially focus on some of the lessons to be learned from conflicts in South Africa with the Marikana tragedy recently. So without further ado, we will go right into our first panelist presentation, Meg Taylor. Thank you. Meg, would you like to? It's up to you.
Would you feel more comfortable if I sat or? Yeah, okay. But first of all, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Guarani people, and thank them for welcoming us here yesterday to all be together and share our experiences. I work at the interface of community and company conflict. This office has been in existence now for 12 years. We have well over 100 very complex cases working in 43 different countries around the world, and it has mandate over the private sector side of the World Bank, but we report directly to the President with these issues. Before we get into solutions, and there are many of you who work in industry in this room that have ideas on how to manage these stakeholder processes to avoid and manage conflicts. But I just want to take us back a bit and look at what is at the very heart of conflict that's emerging around the world. Now, we had presentations yesterday and the discussions around the fact that the next century will be the century of extraction. I think that it'll be the century of extraction with a great possibility of enormous conflict. Why do I say that? Because if you look at what is happening around the world, populations have increased. You also see a competition for resources. And it's not just around the extractive industries. It is around large agricultural development. It is around infrastructure. And somebody has to make room for somebody else. And in the cases that we work in, it is the communities that have to make room for the development that comes along. Now, does that mean that people don't want the development? No, it doesn't necessarily mean that. But it means that there are issues that are of concern to communities and they need to be addressed. Primarily, the issues that are raised that at the very heart of the conflict is around land, water, and loss of livelihood, and I'll come to some of the percentages of the cases that we have and the issues that are raised. About 50% of the cases that come to the CAO are around oil, gas, and mining, and of that, 36% would be in mining itself. And what are the kind of issues that people come to my office with when they file a complaint that the institution has invested in a project, it's lent money to a company to develop a mine or an oil and gas field? The issues that they raise would be 77% of the issues are around socio-economic issues. And if you break that down even further, it comes down to benefits distribution. I am going to make space for this investment to happen in my community. What do I get out of it? That is fundamental. What am I going to? I want to participate in this project. What do I get out of it? 60% of the issues are around consultation and disclosure, information about the project. People just don't know what it is all about, or they don't have enough information around it. 59% issues around land. And what do those land issues entail? Land rights issues, land grabbing, displacement of people, territorial demarcation, resettlement concerns. On water, 45% of the cases we handle are around water, and it's about the scarcity of water, pollution of water, and about the waste management around water. 19% relate to Indigenous peoples' issues. Free, prior, informed consent has now been absorbed into the performance standards of the International Finance Corporation, and the first project that they will be applying this to in Colombia, we will be watching very closely to see what the methodology is and then what the due diligence will be that they will apply. Labour issues, and we've talked a lot about the creation of jobs, but creation of jobs is important, but there are also issues that people need protection on around labour. So 19% of our cases are around that, and 15% around cultural heritage. So the major issues continue to be around the socio-economic issues, and I said we talked about the benefits distribution. And if we look around the world where where the key mining countries are, and in this instance, the Defensoría del Pueblo in Peru has got very good data about the conflicts that are emerging in Peru. Currently, there are 229 conflicts right now, 175 that are active and 54 latent. There are emerging issues in many countries. There's always issues in Papua New Guinea around a mine or around an oil and gas project, but there are also in Africa, in places like Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, in DRC. I don't know if I'm supposed to go into solutions yet. I think we're just trying to just outline what is at the very heart of conflict first, before we have a broader discussion about, well, what is it that we're going to do in terms of stakeholder engagement. So I'll pass on to Aidan.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I feel honoured to be a part of this conversation, to be part of this distinguished panel in front of such a knowledgeable audience. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay tribute to their elders past, present, and indeed, as someone mentioned earlier, future. Rather like that unpopular guest who arrives at a party, I do have a PowerPoint presentation, which we've seen mercifully few of, and it will be very visual in nature, purely because I think there are a couple of things that are best illustrated by pictures as opposed to them perhaps by words, or at least that they help to reinforce the words. And I'd like to start the conversation this morning by making what I think is a fairly important distinction between conflict and violence. Not a semantic one, I think it's an important and a practical one. These are sometimes used interchangeably, but they are quite different. Conflict arises when two or more parties believe that their interests are incompatible, and they either express their concerns or they take action to prevent the other's ability to pursue their interests. This is inherently the nature of conflict. Violence, on the other hand, is an extreme example of how groups or individuals choose to try and address conflict. But the reality is that non-violent conflict is altogether more common and can be essential to social progress and development, and it is often a feature of the interactions between mining companies, their host communities, or their host governments. When violence erupts, however, a profound breakdown in social relationship occurs with destructive effects. And this important distinction was highlighted, I think, very clearly by International Alert in their landmark publication on conflict-sensitive business practices for the extractive industries, which I recommend to all of you. Now, the reason I make this distinction is because I think it's important for this discussion, because while conflict prevention is an important aspiration, it's equally important for all of us here to recognize that companies, communities, and government have to accept the inevitability of some level of conflict. And what's important isn't that conflict doesn't occur, but that they recognize the inevitability and try to ensure that it becomes a focus for constructive rather than destructive interactions. I'm going to focus on three main strategies that help prevent conflict between mining companies and host communities. And my primary focus will be on companies, on industry, although some of what I will say is also relevant, I think, to government and to civil society organizations. The three strategies that I will be outlining are for companies, firstly, to understand the contextual risk factors where conflict may arise. Secondly, it's for companies to understand the causal risk factors that can trigger conflict. And then lastly, It's really to recognize that prevention is always better than cure and to try and act accordingly. Now, several ICMM guidance documents fall into the space of trying to get into prevention rather than cure, but I'm also going to refer to some preliminary analysis that we have done within ICMM, looking at mining community conflicts that illustrate some of those contextual and causal risk factors. And that analysis, to be clear about the limitations of it, it's based on a review of incidents reported to the Business and Human Rights Resource website during 2012. The filter we applied was to define incidents as disputes between companies and communities that either involved protest or the use of force. And using that filter, we identified 42 incidents in 2012 across 26 countries. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on. The first strategy I mentioned is to try and understand the contextual risk factors that make countries or regions at greater risk of conflict. The reality is there is no universally accepted source that will tell either companies, communities, or development practitioners what might give rise to conflict or the prospect of conflict. Many sources either tiptoe around the question of conflict or they aggregate several indicators to give a measure of political instability. For example, Fund for Peace has produced the Failed States Index over the last 8 years, and that, I think, can provide a valuable early warning indication of the potential for conflict. The 2012 index identified 33 countries that had alert status, and they assigned a warning status to a further 90-odd countries. Now, the significance of that is it indicates countries that have either a high risk or very high risk of vulnerability to conflict. So that's a useful kind of source, I think, for companies and for others to look at. Another source that is also worth looking at is the World Bank, and they have an increasing focus on what they refer to as fragility and conflict situations. And they define fragile states as countries that face particularly severe developmental challenges. And that might be by virtue of weak institutional capacity, poor governance, or political instability. Often these countries experience ongoing violence linked to past conflict, and armed conflict is a feature of 3 out of 4 fragile states. The banks identified 33 countries as fragile states, and like the Failed States Index, this is an aggregate measure of various indicators, but it's a useful one. Now, the 2011 World Development Report had a specific focus on conflict, security, and development, and it asked important questions like, what are the factors that increase the risk of violence? Why conflict prevention and recovery are so difficult? And what practically can be done. Now, that report indicated that 25% of the world's population are living in conflict-affected or fragile countries, and that no low-income, fragile or conflict-affected country had yet to meet a single Millennium Development Goal. That, to me, is an extraordinarily sobering statistic. I mentioned earlier that ICMM had done a preliminary analysis looking at 42 instances of mining community conflicts, and that shows, this slide here shows that 19 of the 26 countries where these occurred have been assigned either alert or warning status in the Failed States Index, signifying that they are either at risk of very high risk of or high risk of vulnerability to conflict. Those 19 countries account for over 93% of those 42 incidents. And a closer look at the Failed States Index shows that in 4 countries where 3 or more incidents happen, all are above average for an indicator within the Failed States Index known as uneven economic development. Essentially, this is indicative of divided societies where inequalities are prevalent. Over 60% of the incidents occur in countries that rank in the lower half of the Human Development Index, again, an aggregate indicator of developmental status, and more than 2/3 of those incidents occur in countries within the lower half of the World Bank governance indicators for voice and accountability, political stability, and rule of law. So these kinds of contextual factors really seem to matter. Now, the second strategy I wanted to talk about briefly was to understand the causal risk factors that might lead to company-community conflicts. And to better understand this, what we tried to do is take a closer look at those 42 incidents and identify both a primary trigger, what was the main factor that triggered off either protest or the use of force, as well as underlying factors, the other factors at play. And in doing that, we looked at the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre as a primary source, but in all cases, we tried to supplement with at least one other publicly available source to round out the analysis. And these are the issues on this slide. There's 15 categories of issues that we've identified that cropped up in at least one of the incidents. Some of these are pretty straightforward to understand, things like corruption, for example. Others need a little bit more explanation. So, for example, something like corporate power refers to the perception of undue political influence on the part of a company. Social cohesion relates to the perceived disruption of social order through things like immigration or as a result of other social impacts. And economic impacts include perceived inequities in the distribution of benefits or adverse impacts on local economies, such as inflationary pressures on housing and food. The two most common triggers, as you can see, were economic and environmental factors. I won't say that came as a surprise, but it was kind of quite revealing because they were important both as primary issues that triggered off the use of force or conflict, as well as underlying factors. The other primary factors that were pretty important, we can see, were the inadequacy of consultation, or indeed where there was the perception that companies had failed to respect the rights of indigenous peoples. And in fact, environmental and economic issues were features of more than half of all of the 42 incidents that we looked at. And if you go deeper still and look at just one of those, the environmental indicator, in more than 25%, I think, of all the incidents, water was the primary concern that really kicked off either the protest or use of force. When we get to underlying issues, and that I think is equally revealing, things like social cohesion, things like corporate power, land issues become incredibly important. So we're not trying to pretend that this is a sort of universal typology or that these causal risk factors are exhaustive. And we did undertake limited analysis, and I want to stress that, but they do signify issues that can give an early warning of areas where companies need to be mindful of these kinds of issues in their day-to-day engagement with communities to ensure they don't become a source of conflict over time. Then the third strategy that I wanted to talk about was for companies to recognize that prevention is better than cure and to act accordingly. Once you're in a situation involving the use of force, the prospects for resolving conflicts are greatly diminished. And so it's imperative that companies try and take steps to ensure that they don't get into that situation in the first place. And depending on the circumstances that companies find themselves in, there are 4 possible steps that they can take. Firstly, they should engage with internal or external experts, and crucially, they should consult with stakeholders to understand their country or regional context and the potential for conflict. Now, I've said enough about that already, so I don't intend to dwell on that one. The second thing, though, that they can do is to undertake due diligence to fully understand their local operating context. So for new projects, that means that companies should ensure that their environmental and social impact assessments integrate human rights due diligence, including issues relating to conflict. For existing operations where the potential for conflicts requires perhaps more in-depth consideration, a more focused assessment that looks at issues that might give rise to conflict might be more appropriate. Now, 2 recent publications by ICMM that are helpful resources in conducting this kind of due diligence are a guide we put out last year on integrating human rights due diligence into corporate risk management processes, and one that we did collaboratively with IFC, the ICRC, and the petroleum group IPICA on voluntary principles and security and human rights, and a set of implementation guidance tools around that. Thirdly, companies should ensure that such assessments are designed to recognize and take steps to address vulnerability. As Meg's work has shown over the last decade, it is often the poor and the voiceless that are most disadvantaged in the development process. And failure to identify how they may be adversely impacted by mining projects or to ensure that consultation processes are inclusive of vulnerable groups can often be a source of conflict. And a couple of the resources that we've developed that at least begin to help get at this are the Community Development Toolkit, which was recently revised, and Catherine MacDonald, who was instrumental in producing that work, is here in the audience today, and indeed our Indigenous Peoples and Mining Good Practice Guidance. Fourthly, and almost finally, as Meg has already discussed, companies need to look at grievance redress. The CAO is an extraordinary resource for communities that are adversely affected by projects that IFC or MEAG invest in. CAO has produced excellent guidance on grievance mechanisms. ICMM has also produced sector-specific guidance on handling and resolving local level concerns and grievances, and that advocates involving communities in the design of those grievance mechanisms, and it also recommends that implementation efforts be integrated into the day-to-day management of your community engagement, not as some kind of standalone thing. And then finally, I've mainly concentrated on companies, but I want to just say that there is an important role here for governments and indeed for the development assistance community more broadly. It's clear from the 2011 World Development Report that those countries with the weakest institutions are at greatest risk of instability, conflict, and indeed violence. The solution there lies in concentrated efforts to build legitimate institutions, and this is where organizations such as AusAid, World Bank, and others in this room, and indeed host governments, have a profoundly important role to play. Thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I do my presentation, I would like to really thank the conference organizers and AusAid for having me over here to give you the voices of Solomon Islanders. Yeah? So I'm Doris Puyahi, working for Liban Land Environmental Education, and I represent civil societies. Just one thing before I do my presentation, please look at me as somebody down from the community level who is doing a presentation here, so please put on your community lenses. I would do my presentation in two parts briefly. I would like to look at the potential for conflicts to happen in the Solomon Islands if mining comes up, and what are some of the strategies that we could put in place to make sure that the anticipated conflicts can be minimized. In the Solomon Islands, mining is an emerging industry. We only have one mine in Guadalcanal, our capital of Solomon Islands, and but there are 15 to 20 mining or prospecting licenses being given out. This is telling us a very strong message here that Solomon Islanders has no first-hand experience of logging across the country, but that's the good thing. Yeah, we still have a lot of time to learn from our other Pacific Islanders and around the world. Solomon Islands has a lot of experience with logging. Logging has been happening in Solomon Islands for 40 years, and still people down at the community level do not even know what are the processes involved, the legal processes, what are the advantages and disadvantages of logging. So you can just imagine how logging industry has been with us for 40 years. This is an emerging industry, how it can take very long for people to actually know what are the advantages and disadvantages of this industry. And we are talking about Solomon Islands. 40% of Solomon Islands are illiterate. So you can come up with really, really good legal frameworks and code of conduct practices and all this. But if it's really fancy ones written out in English, but can the people down there at the community level understand those things? English is an elite language. Yeah? Once when we went out to this community and we did this financial literacy awareness, the next time we go to do a follow-up, they didn't do anything. And we found out that only 10 out of those 18 people can read and write. Yeah. So just imagine how this emerging industry can be really devastating for us because people can't really understand what are the things that are involved. At all the stakeholders level, national, provincial, and government, NGOs, and civil society, there's little experience, yeah? Low technical capacity too with people. So if mining comes in, there's this likelihood of not involving people to be part of the workforce, labor force. So people would really feel out of place, and there is potential for conflict with this, especially when people will not be involved, and others from other places need to come in. In the last 3 months, if you look at these Solomon Islands media outlets, you would see a lot of people rising up and discussing their concerns in the media outlets, yeah? Telling the government to delay giving out mining licenses because people still need to know the advantages and things that are involved in this industry. I would give you some quotes, yeah, which I collected from one of the media outlet, just to give you an idea of what it is right now in the Solomon Islands. Yeah. A homegrown group of concerned landowners called Forum Against Mining on Choiseul province. This is one of the provinces where prospecting is happening. Through the media said, there are very important issues that we landowners need to know before our land is given and used for further operation. Because once the digging starts, it is very hard to stop it. The Permanent Secretary for Mines, Energy and Rural Electrification, during a high-level roundtable on development, society and environment, stated that Solomon Islands still does not have a national policy or a maritime minerals policy. And the ministry is currently working on it. So you can imagine if mining comes in, they are free to do anything because it's not been covered in the policies yet. So there is a lot of potential for conflict. A member of the Malaita Masina Forum, in a letter to Solomon Star, sent a very strong message to one of the leaders of the province and the nation that the forum maintained its very strong stand that this industry is not worth it because we all lack the scientific and technical know-how expertise in regards to mining. Solomon Islands, we can learn a lot from our Pacific neighbors, yeah? From the Bougainville crisis, the Fijian PNG mines. Our culture is sort of quite similar, the Melanesian culture. So what happens there is likely to happen too in our country, unless we take really, we make really wise decisions around this industry. I would like to briefly talk to you about some of our experiences with logging, yeah? At Live and Learn Environmental Education, we work in 50 communities that are highly logged in the Solomon Islands. And we've had a lot of experiences where landowners, tribal landowners, experiencing a lot of, land disputes and social issues, teenage pregnancies. The communities are totally fragmented because of the things that are happening around with logging. People are having health problems because their rivers are polluted. And in the Solomon Islands, 85% of land is customary owned. That means it's owned by the people. Only 15% is alienated, owned by the government. So people have a lot of power to say either yes or no to mining. Yeah, that power sort of rests with them. So with our experience with these communities, when we have a lot of cases where, women, children, and men rising up and, challenging the logging companies. And sometimes, they run to them with knives and stones and destroy their working machines and all this. Just because people are not really aware of the laws, the laws, yeah? When something becomes legal, companies are, they are granted licenses to do things. But just because these people are not aware that, these are laws that existed and, they take things into their own hands. So those are things that are very important for us to, consider. If mining comes up, we have to really learn from what has happened with the logging industry. During a research that we did in 2009, we've had a lot of cases reported by the communities about the conflicts that they are experiencing, yeah? And some of these are really, really severe. But what I really want to stress here is logging has been there for more than 40 years. But what are the stakeholders doing to ensure that, we minimize these things? It hasn't happened with the logging industry. So we are very doubtful that it will happen with the mining industry. that is something that, I really want, investors, if they're interested to come to Solomon Islands, to make sure to really know what is the situation there, and to make sure that things are well in place before mining can actually begin. There is also evidence of, I would say, government instability, corruption and conflict of interest, involved with these logging industries. And this has led to a feeling, in the community where there is no trust at all, for the government, just, due to lack of accountability and transparency. We had really huge problems with ministries, really effectively enforcing their roles and responsibilities. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, just some of the things that we've seen in these communities where logging happens is, logging has never been part of our culture, so we don't have any system put in place traditionally to cater for, issues that comes up with logging. So what I really want to put here is there are really two different systems here, the modern one and the traditional one. And there's a really big gap in, bridging these two, the traditional structures and what we would say, the modern way of looking at development. Yeah, there's a really big gap, and that is what is causing a lot of problem here, because usually, higher up here, people don't actually actively involve the people down here, so they don't really feel part of the process. So that is why they cause problems. Yeah, I would also like to talk about the current Mining Act and benefits. Right now across the country, especially at the community level, this question of who is really benefiting, who is really benefiting from the profits made by the companies. People are, there is this really big perception among the people that the companies are going away with the bigger profits, and people are just staying with whatever the company wants to give. So you would come across communities where the logging company is just there with their logging camps, but just looking at the houses there, people don't have really good sanitation. The housing standards are really bad. So you question, where are all these? What do we supposed to get out of this development? Yeah? So these are things the communities are questioning, and they need answers to it. And that is where I think stakeholders should really work together to answer these questions. Let me touch base on some of the strategies which I think should be taken into account to ensure that we deal properly with mining. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so maybe we'll deal with that one.
So as a speaker from South Africa on the topic of conflict prevention through positive stakeholder relationships, I think I must of course begin with events in my own country last year, the wave of strikes in the platinum sector that resulted in what came to be known as the Marikana massacre, when police forces opened fire on protesting miners, mostly from the Lonmin mining company, platinum mining company, killing 34 people. The last time there'd been such deadly use of force by police forces against the civilian population in South Africa was in 1960 in the Sharpeville massacre, when anti-apartheid protesters, many of them school children, were gunned down by police. And news of the shooting, I think the Marikana shooting, certainly sent shockwaves through South Africa and I think elsewhere in the world, and many people found themselves asking how it had come to this point, how had stakeholder relationships broken down to a point where such extreme violence could be the result. And following the massacre, I think many would seek a single explanation for what happened, whether it was poor policing, perhaps police retribution for the murders of 2 police officers in the previous week. Was it inter-union rivalry? or is the story just a story of the exploitation of workers by an uncaring company? But as investigations into Marikana and the work of the Commission of Inquiry that was set up proceeded, I think it became clear that the issue was far more complex and I think tied into many of the issues that some of the speakers have brought up today. Reviewing some of the evidence that has come up, it's really remarkable how poor the stakeholder relationships had really been between the company and the community. A journalist visited the Marikana community after the shooting and spoke to many residents about their experience of life in the community. And one of the first interviewees said simply, people in Marikana feel their problems are not taken seriously. And this was echoed by many of the other residents in the community. And this relationship was not only between community members and the mining company, but also between community members and the local authority, the municipality that was responsible for the town and the informal settlements where many of the miners lived. Certainly there are many failures in the local municipality, corruption, crime, poor housing, poor service delivery generally, poor health and sanitation services. But again and again, this problem of poor communication came up as a key factor. A researcher who'd done extensive work in the community prior to the shooting made a briefing to Parliament, and I'll quote, he said, "There's a huge gap in communication between local government, mining companies, and the various departments. There's no coordination in programs when venturing into social responsibility projects, and that creates a huge problem in communities." Just as an illustration of the kind of difficulties that were faced in that community, in the informal settlement, poor lighting at night was a problem. It led to incidents of sexual violence and crime in the informal settlements. And responding to that need, Lonmin erected a high-mast light that would provide improved lighting and hopefully security in that area. And it did indeed have a positive impact in community, but somehow, there was a miscommunication in the transfer of rights to the local municipality, and a few months down the line when the light broke, no one was willing to take action to actually repair it. Darkness returned, crime returned, incidences of rape and violence returned. And where you started out with a company, perhaps with good intentions, trying to make a difference in a community, you now had a massive monument to everything that was going wrong in that area. There were many other examples. An NGO visited in 2011, well before the shootings, and looking at one of Lonmin's main CSR projects, a hydroponic venture that was supposed to provide employment to about 120 local community members. When they visited the plant, they found a ruined building, dysfunctional equipment, which the company blamed on poor performance by the subcontractor that was responsible for the project. But nevertheless, this is what the community faces. Again, the company provided support to a local school, but did nothing to address the asbestos classrooms that were found there, which were a major health risk to the children and the local community. The same NGO in the same visit also noted various incidences of poor service delivery that could be ascribed to the local authority, broken pipes leading to raw sewage running into the rivers. But I want to emphasize that the conflict that we saw last year didn't come from nowhere. It didn't take much to see that this was a community with a very real experience of marginalization. I do want to touch briefly on the issue of inter-union rivalry. I do feel that it did play a role. And again, I think this could be ascribed to communication and not having a seat at the table. The regime that's in place in South Africa in terms of union representation sets quite high thresholds for participation in unions, representation in unions. So what one typically finds is that the union with majority representation on the mines is allowed to engage with management on behalf of all workers. And smaller unions find themselves with no seat at the table, and that really raises the stakes, and I think led to a strategy by AMCU, which kind of came from nowhere last year and really became a big presence on the mines in this time of violence, but really developed a kind of environment where this kind of radical mobilization could take place. We certainly saw from Marikana that building and maintaining stakeholder relationships it's a complex and ongoing process. It's not easy. In fact, I think if you're a company or a government that thinks it's easy, you're probably doing it wrong. And it is a process. We heard this yesterday about transparency. It's not an event, it's a process. It's not putting up a classroom or ticking a box. It is really an ongoing engagement. Something I'd like to spend just a minute on is also the point that communities are themselves not monolithic entities. They have their own centers of power and socio-political dynamics. And I think this also came out yesterday in our talk about the role of women in mining communities. In our own research, certainly also an incident I'm thinking about is in the Eastern Cape, Kolobeni Sands, a mineral sands project. And here you had a case where exploration was taking place in the midst of significant community resistance, which led to an investigation by the South African Human Rights Commission that indeed confirmed that the public consultation process was deeply flawed. Nevertheless, even after the release of that report, the Department of Mines did issue the mining rights, and which led to further protests and eventually suspension and investigation into this process. And what then followed was a period of almost 2 years of real tensions in the community and lack of communication really from the department, from government, back to the community about exactly what was happening and what the status is. And there were a series of delays, reports that were generated that never found their way back to the community or into the public domain. And it was only much later, in about June 2011, that the message came back that the mining rights had been suspended, but the fault was found more in the environmental process rather than the public consultation process. Unfortunately, this didn't really solve the problems. The community was still very divided, and it opened a loophole for the company then again to submit for exploration rights and just restart the entire process again. And something that came out there was that there was a empowerment company that was founded very early in the process, which had community representation, a handful of local elites, and indeed some elites from towns further away. And this empowerment company was accepted as the representative voice of that community. And it was only through this very protracted process of protests and investigations that it emerged that, in fact, there were major divisions, and the majority of the community were actually opposed to the mine itself. At last night's dinner, I was sitting next to Uma, who was on the panel on women in mining yesterday, and we talked about the complexities of resettlement and the incident in Papua New Guinea where the mining company did build new houses. I'm sure to many outside observers would seem many degrees better than what had been the case before. But there was no sensitivity to livelihoods, questions of access to land, soil fertility, distance to markets, water rights that we've heard about. And certainly we're seeing this in other cases as well, certainly in Tet Province. The resettlement is an incredibly complex process and often leads to a sense of marginalization in communities, and that really is the core experience, which I think is often the fuel for the conflicts we see. I'm sure we'll talk about strategies, but I briefly just want to perhaps summarize and say that you know, the kind of strategies we need are going to require real sensitivity to the complex internal dynamics in communities, really questioning the issue of community representatives, whether they are perceived as legitimate representatives, and a partnership that includes both national and local government authority and is sensitive to the relationship between the community and the local authority on the one hand and the community and the national government on the other side. And of course, transparency, not as a cure-all, but certainly as a basic condition. Aidan also mentioned this. I want to also make the point that, you know, conflict is inherent in social relations, and that's inside any community, within companies, you know, among the stakeholders in a mining site, within families. So we're talking about preventing conflict, but conflict isn't the problem. The problem is when the institutions and the mechanisms that have been designed to manage conflict, when they break down. And time again, this comes from a breakdown in trust, poor communication, and I think often a superficial effort in terms of building the kind of relationships that are needed to manage stakeholder relationships. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about half an hour for discussion, but allow me to just summarize some of the main points raised and try to frame the discussion for you. Again, reminding you, you have the option to also write down your question if you feel you don't want to address it at the floor, and the ushers will bring your written questions to us as well. Now, in terms of the conversation starting off, we had Meg first pose the elephant in the room question was, you know, mining is a specific problem with regard to development, and disproportionately the number of cases which go to the compliance advisor ombudsman's office come from the mineral sector. And that really shows that there is a specific problem with minerals and development and conflict. So I think that was very important to get on the table, and then some specific examples were provided therein. We then had an exposition from Aidan about the range of variables which can lead to conflict as determined by community perception surveys and a somewhat rigorous analysis done by ICMM and their partners around the causes of conflict. And we saw especially that graph with the 15 different indicators of potential conflict. And economic and environmental really stood out quite notably. And it's important to keep in mind that often we tend to divorce the economy and the environment. And there's a tendency for economists to say that the environment is an externality. And what that graph showed us was that indeed that externality, which may be perceived by economists or indeed by accountants at companies, is often very much an internal and very core part of the conflict itself. And that we live in an ecosystem as well as an economy. And I think that came out quite nicely in that example. We then had a very personal and culturally appropriate presentation about the Solomon Islands and their experiences with forestry and how the disconnect between cultures has exacerbated conflicts. And culture is not just in the context of the specific community, but the culture of the companies that are going in, the culture of extraction itself, and not quite often appreciating the impacts on communities. And that was very eloquently described by Doris. And I'm sorry I had to cut you off, but I'm sure we will get back to some of your suggestions for alleviating those stresses. And then finally, we had an example from South Africa, which is still very raw in many people's minds, especially those of you who are from Africa, about the tragedy at Marikana and the causes of that particular tragedy. And Alex, towards the end of his presentation, highlighted what is also very important to note is that the conflict itself is not often the issue. It's when it becomes violent, it becomes polarized, and it becomes intractable. That is when it becomes a problem, because conflict is often a very important social mechanism for progress. We talk about constructive confrontation, and if we didn't have confrontation, often we probably wouldn't even have any kind of development. But it's when it becomes fractious and divisive and violent that it is a problem, and some of the causes for that were mentioned. And interestingly enough, the role of unions, which were, if you go back in history, a means of trying to resolve and prevent conflicts, they themselves can often become co-opted by other interests and can lead to these issues. So with that, I'll open it up to the floor as well as to your comments, and the panelists can respond as well to any of those thoughts. But it would be nice to get audience participation from the get-go. So the ushers are about as well, if you'd like to provide written questions, but we have a few here. Yes, please, continue.
Hi, my name is Carmel Ampolchi. I'm from Jubilee Australia, an NGO based here in Australia. Okay. And we've heard a lot this week, this past couple of sessions about the Oyu Tolgoi project in Mongolia, which is the subject of two CAO complaints. And work on the project on the mine has continued apace, and financing has been organized by the World Bank, the IFC, and MIGA, and now the export credit agencies, with seeming sort of disregard for the outstanding issues that are important to the community. So I was hoping for some discussion by this panel about how sensible that is from a conflict management point of view. Is that really the way CAO complaints are managed, where they don't actually uphold or suspend action in a mine? They don't facilitate any sort of suspension. They sort of sit to the side. And is that most sensible?
The CAO doesn't have the power to stop any project. And that's made very clear to those who file a complaint to the office at first instance. If we did that, then we would stop a lot of cases when people file a complaint to us, the decision of whether a project goes ahead or doesn't go ahead is at the board. The process and the way we work is that the bar is very low. Anybody can file a complaint if they believe that they have been negatively impacted or harmed by a project that IFC or MIGA has invested in or has lent money to. From the dispute resolution side of our office, we convene the community, the company, and in some instances, local level government if they want to be party to a dialogue to try and resolve these issues. In some instances, people say, don't want to talk to the company, and then it goes to the compliance side of our office that does the investigations in terms of the due diligence of the institution. Did the IFC or MIGA apply the performance standards? But in terms of suspension of a project, we don't have the right to suspend a project. That is a decision for the board of the World Bank. That's the governance structure, and we adhere to that.
My question goes to, I believe it's Ms. Doris Pulahi, about the logging situation in the Solomon Islands. I think when she was concluding, she said there are two different streams of logging. That is the native people have been logging for years. And then there's the other stratum of, I believe, is industrial logging. So now the Solomon Islanders, is they are logging for domestic fuel? And if so, even when you log, you deforest, it leads to deforestation. So how do you then replenish the forest? And if it's commercial or industrial logging, then who grants the licenses? And what is the benefit, perceived to be the benefit to the community? Because otherwise, then the natives think that they've been logging and they should be involved in this logging. So one has to factor their experience into it. But if it's logging maybe with chainsaws that they are not used to, and so on, then I would just want to know what the situation is. Who grants these licenses and on what basis? What are the trees to be logged? and so on. So I would want a further expatiation on this.
Okay,
to know
thank
what
you.
the situation is actually
Yes.
on the ground.
Doris?
Yeah, thank you. So your question is who grants the licenses to the landowners, yeah?
Yes, and then the native who've been logging, what is their logging for?
Yes.
For fuel wood?
So subsistence logging, or
Yes,
is it
traditionally
industrial?
it's just subsistence logging where, people use the trees for subsistence needs, like building the house and, all these things. Where, because like I said today, money is not really part of us traditionally. This is just something that came in, very lately. Yeah? We can live without money, and even if we don't have money, we don't, think about suicide and all these things. We still have our resources. Yeah. So that is what I was talking about. Two different systems here, where outsiders come and do these things for really big money. The way we do things, there needs to be a really a bridge in the two different things that are happening here, so that it is harmonized across in the communities.
Yeah, but how does the community that owns the land, where the logging is done, how do they benefit from?
So is there some kind? Yes. So I mean,
They take royalties, royalties from the government. But that, people are not really happy with the way royalties are being distributed, because, the law says, only 10% goes to the communities, and 90% of that goes to the company and to the government. So it's not really bringing a lot of benefits to the people. Yeah, and the government grants licenses to logging companies.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Doris. Other questions? What I might do is take a few questions collectively, and then we'd go back to the panel so we have time. So yes, sir. Here, please.
Thank you, sir. My name is Ayo Lukoni. I'm the High Commissioner of Nigeria. I had privilege and honor to have served in New York, sir, at the permission. And there used to be the UN Center on Transnational Cooperation. And there was a code of conduct on transnational cooperation. And the Center on Transnational Cooperation was helping in terms of capacity building for people in the developing countries to negotiate in terms of contract. Long story short, the center was closed because people thought multinational. I'm asking the question to the representative of the ICCM. I mean, you've given the steps in terms of avoiding conflict, to be proactive. Do you have within the framework of your programs something like capacity building for countries in the developing world in terms of the whole question of helping to raise capacity and experiences for people to negotiate? If we want to be proactive in context of conflict prevention and having agreements that are fair and that, of course, will prevent subconflict. I'm just to the ICC in context of programs within the framework of your. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's a question up here as well, and the lights are blinding me, so I'm sorry for the audience up there. If I can't see you, please let the ushers know. And as I said, you can also write down your questions. Yes, please.
Charles from the Mineral Policy Institute. Up until now, we've been talking about terrestrial mining, but the Pacific Watchers here today will also be aware that deep sea mining or seabed mining is potentially coming to the Pacific. And I wondered what you thought, what the panel, specifically the ladies from the Pacific, thought about how the potential for conflict around that, given some of the rising conflicts, particularly in PNG and perhaps Solomons and even Fiji on terrestrial mining. So, and sort of the distrust of the unknown, and what I seem to see is like a rising push for self-determination, perhaps boosted a little bit by things like the Blue Mud Bay case here in Australia, where traditional owners have been, their sea ownership rights have been recognised.
And yes, so we can frame that question around property rights as potentially a locus of resolving conflicts, and with deep sea mining where they're often not as well delineated. Let's see, on this side we have one here, and then we'll go back to the panel. So three, there's Catherine.
Thank you very much. I'm Catherine Sturman from CSRM. My question is to Alex about South African mining, but my thought came from the slide that that Aidan Davies showed us of your analysis of the 42 incidents of mining-related conflict around the world in 2012. As a South African, I was very struck that you identified 4 countries where there'd been 3 or more incidents, and South Africa had 8 incidents. So it seemed really striking and unique. And the other thing that Alex emphasized was that this was firstly a labor relations related conflict, but it also had to do with the policing failure, this massacre that took place that really shocked South Africans in the severity of its violence of its response. So my question to Alex is, to what extent is the mining-related conflict in South Africa something quite unique to our history, and mining is part of that story of the history of conflict in South Africa, and to what extent can it be analyzed in a kind of international comparison with mining-related conflicts in other countries in the way in which the ICMM has looked at it? You know, how specific is it?
Thank you, Catherine. Again, I would urge you, we have several hands, and I fear I might not be able to get to everyone, but I do want to give you a chance, so please do write down your questions, and I will make sure at least they get some kind of summary. So please do write them down. I'll try my best to get to you on the floor, but please write them down. Just psychologically, it takes longer to talk than to write often, so please do that. Yes, please, going back to the panel, to those 3 questions. We had a question from the High Commissioner regarding the UN Center for Transnational Cooperation.
Great. Yeah. So without speaking to the specifics of the decision around the closure of the center, which I'm not party to, that whole area of the building of capacity for negotiation, I suppose there's 2 levels to look at there. One is, if you like, a government to company interaction around the terms of licensing arrangements, etc. There was a very interesting session just before lunch where we had a number of people talking about some of the arrangements that are in place. So Paulo de Sá from the World Bank, for example, is very active in that space within his institution. There are a number of other institutions who are active in this space as well, including, I think, AusAid and DFID. This may be something that they're engaged in, and various others. Beyond that, there are also some innovative things being done within some of the law firms, where there was an example from a gentleman from Cameroon who talked about contracting in help specifically to help negotiate the terms of a deal with an Australian mining company. It's quite a lot of the major law firms are offering pro bono arrangements, which are very attractive for many of their staff to offer legal advice to host governments in this very area. So that's kind of one level, if you like. The other level is at that sort of company-community interface. And there, I think there are very many good examples of where companies have sought to enable and to build a capacity within the community for negotiation. And I think Bruce Harvey, who was speaking on that same panel before lunch, summed it up very neatly. Ultimately, it is in the long-term interests of company and community that there be long-term stability around projects. Mining companies are there to invest in the long term. And so if getting to a negotiated agreement involves building capacity on the part of communities, in many respects that's in the interest of mining companies to help facilitate that interaction and to iron out some of those asymmetries that might otherwise exist. So there are many examples in that space that I could point to.
Okay, great. And a question on deep sea mining and
deep sea mining. Just very briefly on that one, because it's in the oil and gas industry. There is a great deal less agitation around offshore oil and gas activities as opposed to onshore oil and gas activities until such time as you actually bring the material to shore, and there can sometimes be flashpoints, and indeed flashpoints around the revenues associated with that. I honestly don't know enough in this space other than to say that my suspicion is that the key issue there is around the point of landfall, and particularly if you're in shallow waters where there is disruption of other resources that are being used by local communities, fishermen, etc., but not an area that's...
Doris or Meg, with your experience?
In Melanesia, I would say that... can you hear me?
Yeah, that's good.
In Melanesia, I would say that the issues for deep sea mining will be very similar to the issues that are applicable on terrestrial exploitation of resources. It'll come down to issues of definition of land, definition of utilisation of resources, the definition that communities have about livelihoods, and the benefits distribution that will emerge, that should be coming towards the communities who live along these shores. I know that there's a lot of discussion around this in Papua New Guinea at the moment, and to be honest, I'm not up to date on the latest in terms of what conclusions have been drawn. But I think to say just because it's an extension of the reef and has gone further out into sea doesn't mean that people have certain interests in what happens beyond those shores. And I know that for many companies, Melanesia always seems to be a very complex place to work, but it is a complicated society with very rich cultural diversity, and if you're going to be involved there, then you've got to understand these issues. I mean, that's the way it works.
Mm-hmm. Doris, and have you had any experience yet with deep sea mining?
Yeah, in the Solomon Islands, there are already, they've already made these maps around places where they'll be giving out licenses for prospecting on deep sea mining. The thing in the Solomons is we only have customary laws that takes into account ownership of marine resources just from shore to 200 meters out, but there is not really any laws or policies regarding what is being done offshore, further out in the deep sea. So we have a lot of issues with that. People are really confused as to what will happen.
I should mention that the Australian government has funded a research program related to deep sea mining through the AusAid AIDRA scheme, and I believe the Australian National University got a major grant to look into this over the next 2 years. So please connect with the AusAid Research Office if you're interested in learning more about that. South Africa, there was a question around issues there, Alex, yes?
Sorry, I'll just make a brief comment on the seabed mining as well. Earlier this year I was in Namibia, just beginning to look into the debates happening there on bulk seabed mining for phosphates. And there are also companies currently exploring for phosphate deposits on the west coast of South Africa. And there certainly you see that conflicts have already emerged, and we're starting to see the basic frameworks of the tensions that are going to happen there. As Aidan mentioned, one of the major concerns is the land-based processing, and one of the major criticisms that came out of the process that has, as it's emerged in Namibia, is that the EIA for the mining itself, the seabed mining, was handled as a separate process of the EIA for the shore-based processing. And the argument, of course, is that the two go together, and that if there are concerns for the shore-based, there's no way you can move ahead with the mining. The EIA, I think, has also been recognized as a rather superficial process, and Namibia has been quite lucky in that it's the Ministry of Fisheries, the minister there really took the leadership to elevate this issue and to really provide the impetus and the political clout to actually stall the process. And I think we're seeing a much more in-depth discussion of the relative merits of bulk seabed mining in Namibia. Yeah. The question about South African exceptionalism, I guess. It's true that I think if one looks at South Africa's history, firstly we have, perhaps more so than some other African states, a very long history of mineral exploitation, and also a tradition coming out of the anti-apartheid era of mass demonstrations, increasingly that we've seen that becoming quite violent, being translated more into service delivery protests. But I think the undercurrent there is a sense of desperation in communities, and certainly that is not unique to South Africa. We have seen extreme violence in anti-mining protests and conflicts between workers and management in Zambia already. There have been some cases, I think it was in Cote d'Ivoire, that also led to deaths, conflict between workers and management. The other thing perhaps to point out is that, again, coming back to the decade of extraction and the African century, as many people are talking about it, we are seeing rapid development in a number of African economies such as Mozambique, and certainly further regulatory developments. And perhaps South Africa, in terms of a more diversified society and in terms of the regulatory environment, but certainly the tensions that still exist there and the conflicts that still exist there, perhaps that is giving us some window of the nature of or the form of what conflicts might take in other African countries as well. So I wouldn't argue that South Africa is really an exceptional case. I think there are very important lessons to be learned.
Thank you, Alex. Yes.
Good afternoon, thank you. I'm Sophia, I'm from Peru. So we've been in your maps and the presentations, you talk about us, and I want to do a brief comment about the role of government, because I come from the National Office of Dialogue and Sustainability. So as government, we have taken this problem of management of stakeholder and social conflict really seriously, and we created a new office, new policies. And I was asking, how are you thinking the role of the government? Is only a mediator, a facilitator? It has responsibilities? And what are the strategies that we as government can implement in order to do prevention and to do social conflict management?
So
thank you.
Okay, thank you. So is government part of the solution as a mediator and so on? Yes, so we'll come back to that, but still we'll take a few more. And please, again, try to make your questions brief. Yes.
Yeah, good afternoon to you. My name is Bunda, I'm from Zambia, and I work for University of Zambia. My question is, if you look at the chart on conflicts in the whole world, you find that more conflicts are in Africa. So why is it that the conflicts are concentrated in Africa and not in the developed countries like Australia? And then the second one is, yesterday there was a presentation where someone said, as long as you invest in Africa, you have to pay the community very little money, not as compared to what a white man will get, according to his statement. So don't you think that is the beginning of conflicts? If you pay less, the locals, and then a white man will get more than maybe 10, 20 times than a local. Don't you think that's the beginning of conflicts? Thank you.
Thank you, yes. So first of all, I'd just like to, that question, I'd like to just challenge you a little bit and say that there are conflicts in the developed world around mining as well. Often they are manifest in different ways. They may not be as violent. In some cases, they can be violent. Indeed, there are examples of that in Australia as well. But yes, there are ways in which situation is more grim in Africa, but please keep in mind conflicts are there in other places as well. Yes, please. There was one person upstairs. Yes, please.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to make a comment. Sorry, my name is Jerry, and I'm from Papua New Guinea.
Yes.
I was just trying to make a comment on the seabed mining. Our Minister for Mining approved the initial exploration permits for the seabed mining to take place. The backlash, however, came from the fact that the communities were not consulted properly in terms of, one, the technology that was going to be used, and two, the possible environment damage and the impact it will have on their traditional fishing grounds. And that's where it has come to right now. So they're trying to sort those issues out.
Okay.
Just for the clarification of those who are listening.
Thank you for that clarification, sir. Yes, I'll take one more question here, and then I'm going to read out some questions. We'll go back to the panel, and then they'll have a chance to sum up in terms of what they see as the way forward to resolving some of these questions. Yes, sir.
Papua New Guinea has a remarkable history of resolving one of the worst conflicts over mining, involving the Bougainville mine, which was one of the biggest in the world. It led to the closure of the mine, thousands of deaths in conflict, resolved by a very long and difficult peace process. And now, surprisingly, the Bougainville people are looking to reopen the mine. There's 4 people from the Bougainville government here, sitting up from the Bougainville government and landowners sitting upstairs. I work with those people. The conflict was caused by the sorts of things that Meg's talking about, disputes over resources, but now Bougainville looks like inviting back the company, Rio Tinto. They say mining's a devil, but if they're going to have a devil, they want a devil they know and a devil that knows them. But the biggest single issue that's bringing them together is that they're going to have the major control over the distribution of revenue. The thing that's causing the most conflict over it is small foreign companies that are trying to take advantage of limited law and order control that the government has, and they're actually trying to cause disruption to stop Rio Tinto coming back, because that will disrupt their interests. I'm wondering if the panel have any comments on those sorts of issues, because it's not always the immediate stakeholders, it seems to me. There's often others deeply involved and have an interest in causing conflict.
Yes, indeed. Yep. The Bougainville case is the one which is now also ripe for further research. There is actually at Griffith University a research project underway around conflicts between illegal mining and the larger mining development prospects again there. So again, one to watch. I don't know if people can give specifics on it here, but it's definitely a very important case, which I'm glad you have alerted us to again. So what I've done now is I've shared some of the comments which were written by the audience, and some of them are specifically addressed to particular panelists. And in their closing comments, which we have about 7 minutes for, I'd request them to try and capture some of those questions, but to have a sort of a prospective conclusion of how we might try and resolve these conflicts moving forward. I really appreciate the audience's vibrant participation, and I tried my best to give you a voice, but given the time limitations, we have to work with what we can with these multimedia opportunities. So, Meg, would you like? Okay, we can start there. Alex, would you like to sum up in terms of? There wasn't a specific question for you, but in terms of, if you'd like to sum up with any solutions which you think moving forward for conflicts, more generic, not specific to Marikana.
Can you hear me? Yeah, this mic's working.
Okay.
Before I just want to make very brief remarks on one or two of the questions that came out. Firstly, on the role of government, I mentioned the problems that were found in the Tolobeni mineral sands project in the Eastern Cape. I think government has a key role in facilitating communication, and often one finds that the frustration which may erupt in violence in communities emerges as much from a lack of consultation and a lack of communication from government as it is from a lack of communication from the companies. So certainly governments have a huge role to play. Often there's this perception in communities, and we see this all over, as a kind of an unholy alliance between large foreign firms and the national government that actually don't have the interests of the local community at heart, and that needs to be addressed. And certainly, as you said, there was the question about conflicts in Africa. I think before lunch we had a panel of mostly Latin American speakers, and I'm sure they'll also point out that there's plenty of conflicts all over the world, including that part. I haven't got all that much to add, really, as summing up. I think the key points have really come out in what I've been.
That's fine.
Yeah, I think the key thing really is about communication. And I mean, time and again, when you go back to conflicts and violence that has emerged, it is really a process of violence. Doesn't just appear out of thin air. It's a process of a gradual breakdown of trust, a breakdown in communication that leads to these kind of situations.
Okay, great. Thank you. Doris, any concluding thoughts?
Thank you for that question. When talking about the role of government, in conflict resolution, I think it's really, really important. The government represents people's interests, down at the all over the country. So it needs to really take into account, traditional structures, what people used to do to mitigate or solve issues, traditional structures which people use to solve issues, and not come with new ways of sorting out things. Now, one thing I really want to put forward here is inclusive participation of people. The government really needs to make sure that people are, inclusively included in the process. Yeah? And I want to put a point on how realistic that is, because we always talk about inclusive participation and all this, but how realistic are we doing it down there? Yeah? Let me put you into the context so that you kind of picture it out. When you talk about inclusive participation, you need to take into account the context that is there. Yeah? From a community perspective, from where I came from, people in the community, they hold different power. Power holders are there in the community. Yeah? And sometimes when you need to consult them for something, you really need to make sure that they are there. If you make a meeting and they are somewhere else, later on, you would face problems. Yeah? So these are things that the system needs to really take into account. Very simple things, but in the long run, it contributes to success.
Thank you very much.
So just a couple of things on the role of government. I mean, firstly, and perhaps most importantly, government creates the enabling environment within which investment takes place. And there is an incredibly important role there for governments to facilitate and encourage investment by responsible companies, and to ensure that companies who are less disposed to responsible behavior are required to perform to a high standard. I think that's one critical point. I think the other thing is there is a role for government, because quite often when you look at some of those tensions that arise between companies and communities, and you go right to the base of those underlying factors, what is often at play is a failure of government perhaps to play a facilitative role in social and economic development. There is sometimes a retreat of government on the expectation that companies will fill gaps in terms of provision of social and economic infrastructure or opportunity. Companies cannot go it alone, and so I think there is an important role that government has to be a partner in social and economic development, and not to abandon, I suppose, communities and companies to sort of slug it out, as it were. There was a question that came through from the audience around investor disclosures around conflicts. It's an interesting one. I think increasingly investors are starting to look quite closely at the way in which companies manage their interactions with communities. There's an interesting paper by Daniel Franks from CSRM here in Australia, and Rachel Davies, formerly of the Ruggie team, that looked at the costs of conflicts, and I recommend that to those of you who have an interest in that. And then lastly, there's a question here that came from the audience. Again, it's a written one. It's asking about, is there a need to revisit sustainable development given the prevalence of economic and environmental issues in terms of the underlying causes of conflict? Do we need to have more of a focus on the valuation of ecosystem services? I don't think it's a substitute for, but I do think it is an important aspect in looking at the potential impacts, I suppose, of companies, that those impacts on the services that people derive, be it from water, forests, other forms of natural resources, are taken into consideration as part of the assessment process. Meg, I'll leave it to you.
If you work in the conflict resolution space, the role of government is extremely important. At any time when we are conducting a mediation, and some of our mediations and assisted negotiations between company and communities can go on for 2, 3 years, 4 years. If government, we expect government, particularly local level government, if they have an interest in what is going on, or they've been the licensing body, participate in the dispute resolution. But at any time they can ask us to leave if they don't think that that we're infringing on the sovereignty of the country. So we have to be very careful in what we do. There was a question here about, perhaps that conflict is driven because of the disparities in the distribution of wealth, etc. And that is very clear in the cases that come to the CAO. And for our African friends here, most of the cases that come to my office are actually from Latin America. And I think that is also because there is a very robust community of civil society that work with communities and bring cases to our office. In Africa, we're just starting to get more cases now. But if we could go back in time and not look at offices of remedy like the CAO, it comes to the very heart of what the High Commissioner for Nigeria said. You know, we come back to the way agreements are structured. And yesterday, I was very proud of Graham Hancock giving an eloquent presentation on the national development process that Papua New Guinea goes through, particularly when it is the process whereby communities, subnational government or provincial government, national government, a company, is all party to that process. I mean, it's unique. There is nowhere else in the world that actually does that. And there are many places in the world we've worked, and one thing that we do want to know when we go into an area where there's conflict is just how those agreements have been structured. What does the subnational government get? What does the distribution then to the community? What are the royalties? What are the other benefits, etc.? Because it does have impact on how people think, well, my livelihood's affected here. I've had to give up something. What am I going to get out of it? So that's, if we could go back in time, let's look at how the agreements have been arranged. But we don't have the opportunity to do that. We come in when there is a conflict. And when we come in there, what is it that the company has in place? And there's a lot of talk now about having grievance mechanisms in companies. Many companies don't want to use the word grievance because they think, oh, everybody's going to give us this problem, bring us problems. But you've got to have a place where people can come and talk to you about the issues that are of concern to them. They should be able to talk to the subnational government. They should be able to talk to the company. The staff of the company have got to be sensitized to the fact that conflicts can emerge, and then how you're going to deal with it, how you're going to talk through it. You've got to have committed staff that are responsible for this. But at the end, you've got to have senior management of the corporations that are totally responsible for what goes on at those mine sites, and be accountable to both the communities that they work with and to the public on what goes on in those operations.
Thank you so much to our panelists, to the audience. The questions which were not fully addressed by the panelists, feel free to come and approach them. They do have them here. There will be opportunities also outside. I'll make sure we are all available in the tea area for you to grab us as needed. And please do be back at 4 for the final session. Thank you.